The ledgers kept by Charleston slave traders followed strict conventions. Every transaction documented with clinical precision. Name if one existed. Age approximate when exact records weren't available. Physical condition, skills, purchase price, sale price, profit margin. But in the winter records of 1,847, one entry violates every standard practice the trading houses had established over decades of operation. A woman identified only by a lot number, no name recorded, sold and resold 17 times across 4 years. Each sale separated by days, sometimes hours. Each buyer a man of substantial wealth and reputation. Each resale conducted at devastating financial loss with sellers refusing to provide explanations, refusing to answer questions, some refusing to even speak her name aloud after they'd returned her to market. 3 of these men, planters who'd built fortunes on rice and cotton, abandoned estates worth tens of thousands of dollars within months of purchasing her, just walked away from generational wealth. 2 others died under circumstances. Their families spent considerable money to keep from public discussion. And in 1851, the auction house that had processed most of these transactions took the extraordinary step of destroying all documentation related to this woman, claiming water damage in a year when Charleston's weather records show no significant rainfall, no floods, no storms that could have justified such destruction. The paper trail was deliberately erased, but people remembered. Whispered conversations in counting houses, coded warnings passed between plantation owners, a name that appeared in private correspondence but never in official records, and a question that haunted Charleston's commercial district for years afterward. What happened during those nights that made wealthy men choose ruin over keeping one silent woman under their roofs for even a single evening more? Charleston in the 1,842 seconds existed as the wealthiest city in the American South. Prosperity built entirely on the labor of enslaved human beings who outnumbered free white residents almost 2 to 1. The city's elite families, names that appeared on bank charters and shipping manifests and deeds to thousands of acres, competed not just in land ownership, but in visible demonstrations of refinement. The quality of one's house servants reflected directly on social standing. Women who could perform delicate work, who moved through rooms without drawing attention, who understood complex instructions without needing repeated explanation. These commanded premium prices at the auction houses lining Charmer Street. The rice plantations surrounding Charleston formed their own isolated world, accessible primarily by river through miles of reclaimed swamp. These estates sprawled across thousands of acres, their manor houses rising on brick foundations to escape the humidity that rotted wood and bred disease in the low country heat. Yellow fever arrived with dependable cruelty each summer. Mosquitoes bred in standing water that surrounded every plantation. The social structure depended entirely on maintaining rigid hierarchies, and any disruption to established order sent waves of anxiety through communities that lived in constant, unspoken terror of the people they held in bondage. Into this world, in March of 1847, came a woman whose origins remained suspiciously vague. The bill of sale identified her as property from a deceased estate in Beaufort County, approximate age 19 years. Described as healthy, trained in needlework and chamber service, physically attractive according to the standards white buyers used to evaluate human beings they intended to purchase. Unable to speak. No family name, no history, no explanation for how a young woman with years of expensive training in household service had ended up in an estate sale with documentation so minimal it bordered on suspicious. The auctioneer conducting that March sale was a man named Virgil Haskey, who'd spent 2 decades in the slave trading business and could evaluate paperwork with the expertise of a lawyer. He told his brother later in a conversation preserved in private letters now held by historical archives that something felt wrong about this woman's documentation. The handwriting changed midway through the document. Dates appeared smudged as though someone had altered them after initial recording. The signature of the estate executive was illegible to the point of being meaningless, but the woman herself appeared exactly as the paperwork described. Young, well-formed, with a bearing that suggested careful training. She stood on the auction platform without visible expression, while Haskett called for bids, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance that no one else could see. Richard Garr made the winning offer, $1,240, a sum that raised eyebrows even among Charleston's wealthiest buyers. Garr owned Fairweather Plantation, 3,000 acres along the Ashley River, and had recently lost his wife to complications following childbirth. He had 2 young daughters who needed care, and he'd specifically requested a woman who wouldn't gossip or carry tales between the manor house and the slave quarters. A woman who couldn't speak seemed ideal for his purposes. She rode to Fairweather in the back of Guiar's wagon, her belongings contained in a single cloth bundle. She was given a small room off the main kitchen, assigned a pallet and blankets, and told her duties would include mending, light cleaning, and attending to Guar's motherless daughters. The plantation's other enslaved people, 43 souls working the rice fields and maintaining the household, were instructed to help her adjust to her new situation. But something became immediately apparent to those who shared living space with her. The woman never slept, or rather, she appeared to sleep, lying motionless on her pallet with eyes closed. But anyone passing her room at night could tell she remained awake. Her breathing never deepened into the rhythms of genuine rest. Her body never relaxed, and occasionally in the hours well past midnight, people with rooms nearby reported hearing a sound. Not words, not quite music, just a low, sustained tone that seemed to vibrate in the chest that you felt as much as heard. On her third night at Fairweather, Guar's oldest daughter, Catherine, woke to find the woman standing beside her bed. The girl later described what happened to her aunt, testimony preserved in family letters with a clarity suggesting genuine terror rather than childhood imagination. The woman stood perfectly still in the darkness, close enough that Catherine could feel breath on her face. When Catherine screamed, the woman didn't move, didn't startle, didn't react in any way. She simply remained standing there until Guar burst into the room carrying a candle, demanding to know what was happening. Guar dismissed it as confusion. The woman was new to the household. Perhaps she'd mistaken which room she was meant to be in. But the following night, he woke to find her standing at the foot of his own bed. The house was locked, every door secured. She had no logical reason to be in the family's private quarters. And yet there she stood in the darkness, visible only because moonlight through the window caught her silhouette. When Guar demanded an explanation, she of course provided none. She simply stood there, her eyes reflecting what little light existed in the room until he ordered her back to her quarters. The next morning, Guar rode to Charleston and returned the woman to Ryan's Mart. He refused to discuss specifics, stating only that she was unsuitable for his household needs. He accepted a loss of $300 on the resale rather than keep her for another night under his roof. The second buyer was a widower named Thomas Porche, who owned a smaller plantation near Goose Creek. Porche had a reputation for harsh discipline and believed Guar had simply been too soft in his management. He paid $950 and brought the woman to his property with explicit instructions to his overseer. She was to remain in the slave quarters, perform field labor, and under no circumstances enter the main house. This arrangement lasted exactly 4 days. On the fifth morning, Porche's cook, a woman named Diner who'd served his family for 20 years, found her master sitting in his study. He was awake but completely unresponsive, his eyes fixed on the window, his face carrying an expression, Danina later told the parish priest, looked like a man who'd seen his own death approaching. When she finally managed to rouse him, Porcher's first words were simple and direct, "Get her off my land." The woman had never entered the house. She'd remained in the quarters exactly as instructed, but Porch insisted she leave immediately. He wouldn't explain what had happened. He refused to discuss it with his overseer, his neighbors, or the slave traders. He simply wanted her gone, and he wanted it accomplished that same day. Back to Charleston, she went for the third sale. Now the pattern began attracting serious attention among the trading community. Virgil Hasuet noted in his ledger, a detail preserved because this particular ledger survived a fire that destroyed most of his records, that rumors were circulating regarding Lot 47. The price dropped to $720. The buyer was a plantation owner from Edisto Island named Marcus Brevard, a man known throughout the Low Country for his rational temperament and his obsessive record-keeping. Brevard documented everything about his properties, weather patterns, crop yields, the health and behavior of every person he enslaved, maintenance schedules, profit margins. He kept journals with the precision of a scientist conducting experiments, and Brevard kept the woman for 9 days, longer than either previous owner. His journal entries from this period were later obtained by his great-granddaughter, who donated them to a university archive in the 1920s, where they remained unexamined until a graduate student discovered them in 1963. The entries are disturbing in their clinical detachment, a man trying to observe and document something he cannot fully understand. Day 1, he wrote, "The woman appears competent at assigned tasks. She completes work without requiring instruction. However, she maintains unsettling eye contact when observed. Most enslaved people lower their eyes in the presence of whites. This woman does not." Day 3. She has not spoken, which is expected given her condition, but I observe her lips moving when she believes herself unobserved. No sound emerges. I cannot determine what she attempts to communicate or to whom. Day 5. I woke at 3 o'clock in the morning to find my bedroom door standing open. I distinctly remember securing it before retiring. The woman was discovered in the hallway directly outside. She offered no explanation for her presence, though, of course, she cannot speak. I have ordered she be confined to the quarters after dark with the door locked from outside. Day 7. Confinement has proven impossible to maintain. She was found this morning standing outside my bedroom window. We are on the second floor of the house. There is no ladder, no trellis, no logical means of ascent. My overseer suggests she climbed the downspout, but I personally examined it this afternoon. The pipe would not support the weight of a grown woman. Yet somehow she was there, standing at a second-floor window, looking in at me while I slept. Day 9. I cannot continue this arrangement. Something is profoundly wrong, though I cannot articulate precisely what. She has done nothing overtly threatening. She performs assigned work adequately. She has not harmed anyone or damaged property. Yet I find myself unable to sleep, unable to think with clarity. My hands shake. I see her face when I close my eyes. I will return her to Charleston tomorrow and accept whatever financial loss this decision entails. The journal includes one final entry about the woman written 3 weeks after her departure. I learned today that Thomas Portier has died. The official cause was listed as heart failure. His family found him in his study sitting in his chair with an expression that disturbed even the undertaker who prepared the body. I think of the woman constantly. I wonder how many more men will purchase her before they understand what I now know. That some forms of knowledge cannot be unlearned, that some kinds of seeing cannot be unseen. The slave trading community in Charleston was relatively small, perhaps 24 men who controlled the major auction houses and private sales. Information spread quickly among them. By the time of the 4th sale in late summer of 1847, every trader in the city knew about Lot 47. Some refused to handle her sale entirely. Others saw opportunity in the situation. The price continued to drop $580, then $450, then $330, less than a quarter of Guar's original investment. The buyers changed as well. No longer wealthy planters seeking household servants, but speculators looking for bargains, men who thought they could break whatever behavior pattern she exhibited through harsher treatment, or desperate owners seeking cheap labor for dangerous work that other enslaved people refused to perform. A lumber mill operator bought her for $330 and put her to work feeding logs into cutting machines. She performed the work adequately during daylight hours, showing no sign of the difficulties previous owners had reported. But on the 3rd night of her employment, a fire started in the mill's main building. The operator accused her of arson, though no evidence supported this accusation. She'd been locked in the workers' quarters all night with multiple witnesses who confirmed she never left. Yet the operator insisted she was somehow responsible for the fire. He sold her within the week, refusing to keep her on his property any longer. A rice plantation owner near Georgetown purchased her for $280, intending to use her in the fields where her inability to speak wouldn't matter. He kept her for 12 days. His overseer's report, preserved in plantation records, notes that she worked efficiently without complaint, but other enslaved workers refused to sleep near her. They claimed something wasn't right about her, that she watched people while they slept, that the air felt heavy and oppressive when she was present in a room. On the 13th day, the plantation owner's son, a boy of 14, went missing. The entire plantation searched for 3 days, checking every building, every field, dragging sections of the swamp. They found the boy alive but severely dehydrated, insisting he'd followed the woman into the marsh because she'd been calling him somehow. When asked to explain what he meant by calling when she made no sound, the boy couldn't articulate it clearly. He simply said he knew he had to follow her, that she was communicating something urgent even though she never spoke, never made any gesture he could describe. The plantation owner returned her to market immediately, not even bothering to collect the full amount he'd paid. He told the auction house to keep the difference if they'd simply take her off his hands. 17 sales across 4 years, each buyer paying less than the last, each keeping her for shorter periods. The documentation became increasingly irregular as time went on. Some sales weren't properly recorded at all. Names were omitted from standard forms. Dates were estimated rather than precisely noted. It was as if the entire trading community wanted to erase any evidence she'd ever existed while simultaneously being unable to forget her. Stories spread beyond the auction houses and commercial offices. In the taverns along East Bay Street, plantation owners shared rumors over whiskey. the woman who made men abandon their homes, the silent one who drove strong men to terror. Some claimed she was cursed, that she'd been hexed by someone who practiced African spiritual traditions. Others suggested she'd witnessed terrible crimes and had been struck mute by trauma, that she carried some knowledge so horrible it manifested as a kind of spiritual contamination that affected anyone who spent time near her. A few whispered that she wasn't entirely human, that she was something else wearing human form. Haskett, the original auctioneer, became obsessed with understanding what was actually happening. He began tracking down previous buyers, conducting quiet interviews, piecing together a chronology of events. His notes found among his personal effects after his death in 1856 suggest he developed a theory. He believed the woman possessed some ability to sense men's hidden crimes, their secret shames, the acts they'd committed that poisoned their sleep and corrupted their peace. He wrote in his private journal that every man who purchased her carried secrets of the darkest kind, and that somehow her presence drew these secrets to the surface, forced men to confront what they'd successfully avoided confronting for years. But this theory couldn't explain everything. Some of the buyers appeared to be ordinary men, no worse than any other plantation owner in a society built on the enslavement of human beings. Yet they too became desperate to rid themselves of her after only days. What was she doing during those nights? How was she leaving locked rooms? Why did her mere presence create such profound psychological distress? By 1850, the woman had been sold 14 times. She'd lived on more than a dozen different plantations across the Low Country. She'd been assigned to every conceivable type of labor: house service, field work, laundry, cooking, child care, mill work. Nothing altered the pattern. Purchase. Brief period of apparent normalcy, rapidly escalating unease, desperate resale at financial loss. The 15th buyer was different from those who'd come before. His name was Nathaniel Harrington, and he owned a medium-sized plantation near Jacksonboro. Harrington had a reputation as a relatively fair master by the standards of that time and place. He didn't separate families when he sold people. He allowed enslaved workers small garden plots for their own use. He rarely employed the whip. He was also a meticulous record keeper and an amateur naturalist who corresponded with scholars about soil composition, bird migration patterns, and weather phenomena. Harrington approached the purchase scientifically. He'd heard all the stories circulating about Lot 47, and he didn't believe in curses or supernatural explanations for observable events. He theorized that the woman suffered from some form of mental affliction that manifested in disturbing nocturnal behavior, perhaps a type of sleepwalking or seizures that occurred primarily at night and created unsettling effects that superstitious men interpreted as something sinister. He believed that with careful observation and proper documentation, he could identify the actual problem and either correct it or at least manage it well enough to make productive use of her labor. He paid $180, a price so low it suggested no other buyers were willing to make offers, and brought her to his plantation in November of 1850. He assigned her to household work, gave her a private room, and instructed his wife Margaret to treat her with basic kindness while observing everything she did. Harrington himself kept detailed daily journals about her presence on his property. The journals from the first week are almost mundane in their observations. The woman performed household tasks competently. She understood instructions communicated through gestures and demonstrations. She ate normal portions at mealtimes. She showed no obvious signs of distress or unusual behavior during daylight hours. Margaret Harrington reported that the woman was actually pleasant company in a strange way, that her silence felt restful rather than unsettling, that she worked efficiently without requiring supervision. But Harrington's nighttime entries tell a completely different story. Night 1, he wrote, "I woke at 2 o'clock in the morning to the sound of humming, a very low frequency, almost below the threshold of normal hearing, more like a vibration than an actual sound. I traced it to the woman's room. She appeared to be asleep on her pallet, but the sound was clearly emanating from her body. I observed for several minutes. Her lips were not moving. The sound seemed to come from somewhere deeper in her chest or throat. When I touched her shoulder to wake her, the sound stopped instantly. She opened her eyes but showed no surprise at my presence, simply looked at me with complete calm. I returned to my own bed but found sleep impossible for the remainder of the night." Night 3. Margaret woke me at midnight genuinely terrified. She said someone was in our bedroom. I lit a candle and found the woman standing near our wardrobe, just standing there in the darkness, not moving, not doing anything except existing in a space she had no reason to be. When I asked what she was doing, she of course could not answer. I led her back to her room by candlelight, and this time I locked her door from the outside. In the morning, the lock was still secure. Yet I found her in the kitchen before dawn preparing breakfast as though nothing unusual had occurred. Night 5. I cannot explain how she escapes from a locked room. I have personally examined the door, the windows, every floorboard. There is no secret passage, no loose boards, no possible exit except through the door I myself secured with a lock I personally tested. Yet she appears wherever she chooses during the night. Tonight I found her standing in my study. She was positioned in front of my bookshelf, her hand resting on one specific journal, my private journal from 1843. The year I made certain decisions regarding the sale of a family. I never recorded those decisions in writing anywhere. No one knows about them except the men directly involved, and most of them are dead now. How could she possibly know to touch that specific journal? Night 7. I am beginning to understand what the previous owners experienced. It is not that she does anything overtly threatening. She never speaks, obviously. She never acts with violence. She never even appears angry or agitated, but her presence at night creates a sensation I can only describe as exposure, as if she can see through walls, through time, through the careful lies we construct about who we are and what we have done. I find myself thinking about things I have not consciously considered in years, decisions I made that seemed necessary at the time, things I witnessed and did nothing to prevent, compromises I accepted as simply the way business was conducted. Her silence feels accusatory, though she makes no accusations. Her stillness feels like judgment, though she exhibits no obvious judgment. Night 10. Margaret begged me today to sell the woman, not because she has done anything harmful to Margaret specifically. During daylight hours, she has been nothing but helpful and competent. But Margaret can no longer sleep properly. None of us can. The house feels wrong at night, heavy, oppressive. I wake constantly with absolute certainty that someone is watching me. Sometimes when I light a candle, she is there. Sometimes she is not. The uncertainty has become worse than her actual presence. Night 12. I must maintain rational perspective about this situation. I am an educated man. I studied at the College of Charleston. I correspond with scientists. I do not believe in hauntings or curses or supernatural phenomena that violate natural law. Yet I cannot explain what is occurring in purely material terms. How does she leave locked rooms? Why does her presence create such consistent psychological distress across multiple intelligent, rational men? Why does every person who purchases her become obsessed with examining their own past actions? I spoke yesterday with Samuel Thornton, one of the previous owners who sold her after less than a week. He admitted something he has never told anyone else. During the days he kept her on his property, he became convinced she knew about his first wife's death. The official story was fever, which is common enough in the Low Country. But Thornton's physician had prescribed laudanum for the wife's nervous condition, and Thornton had increased the dosage substantially without consulting the doctor. The wife died of respiratory failure. Thornton was never questioned because physician-prescribed laudanum deaths are tragically common. But Thornton said that when the mute woman looked at him, he felt absolute certainty that she knew that she was waiting for him to confess that her silence was more accusatory than any spoken words could possibly be. Night 14. Last night I dreamed about the family I sold in 1843. A mother and 3 children, a buyer from Alabama offered premium price for the children alone. Young, healthy, likely to provide decades of productive labor. But he did not want the mother, who was approaching 40 and had chronic health issues that reduced her value. I could have refused the sale. I could have kept the family together. Instead, I separated them because the profit margin was substantial. The mother begged me, offered me anything, said she would work without complaint until she died if I would simply not take her children. I refused because business is business and sentiment cannot govern commercial decisions. I have not thought about this transaction in 7 years. I convinced myself long ago that it was simply economics, just the natural function of the market, just the way our society operates. But last night I dreamed of that mother's face, the exact expression she wore when the buyer's men took her children. And when I woke, the woman was standing at the foot of my bed. Her expression had not changed from the calm neutrality she always maintains. She was not accusing me. She was not doing anything except standing there in the darkness. But I felt something break inside my chest. I felt genuine anguish for the first time since 1843, as if her presence was forcing me to actually feel what I had successfully avoided feeling. I wept. God help me. I wept like a child while she stood there watching me with those calm, unchanging eyes that seemed to see everything I had ever done, and everything I had ever been. Night 15. I took her back to Charleston today. I could not keep her another night in my house, but I did not return her to the slave traders. Instead, I went to the church. I spoke with Father Ali at St. Michael's. I told him everything about this woman, about the pattern of sales, about my own experiences. I confessed things I have never told another living soul. Father Ali listened without interruption. When I finished, he said something I cannot stop thinking about. Perhaps God has sent you a mirror. Perhaps she reflects back what you carry inside. The question is whether you are brave enough to look at what you see. Harrington's journal ends there regarding the woman. There are no more entries about her specifically, but church records from St. Michael's in Charleston show that Nathaniel Harrington made a substantial donation to the church in December of 1850, along with a written statement legally freeing 3 families he had held in slavery, a total of 11 human beings. He also made provisions in his will to free the remainder of his enslaved population upon his death, which occurred in 1859. The woman was not among those freed. She had already been sold again by the time Harrington made these arrangements. The 16th buyer was a man named Cornelius Gage. He paid $125. By this point, the woman was selling for less than the cost of a decent plow horse. Gage owned a small rice plantation near the Comahi River, isolated enough that he rarely encountered neighbors or visitors. He was known as a hard man who had built his modest wealth through ruthless efficiency and who had no patience for what he called superstitious nonsense. Gage thought the previous owners were simply weak. He believed the woman's behavior, whatever it actually consisted of, could be controlled through strict discipline and complete isolation. He put her to work in the rice fields during the day and locked her in a storage barn at night, separated from all other buildings on the property. He told his overseer that if she somehow escaped confinement, she was to be whipped and placed in stocks as punishment. She never attempted to escape, but within 3 days of her arrival, Gage's entire rice crop began failing. The seedlings withered despite adequate water and proper planting technique. The dikes that controlled water flow developed leaks that couldn't be easily repaired. Equipment broke in unusual ways. 3 different workers suffered injuries in separate accidents across a single week. Gage's overseer, a man named Thaddeus Cooper, who had worked rice plantations for 15 years, told Gage directly that the plantation was cursed, and they needed to remove the woman immediately. Gage refused. He was not a man who backed down from challenges or admitted mistakes. He kept the woman for 3 weeks, longer than most recent owners had managed. During this time, according to Cooper's later testimony recorded when he sought employment elsewhere and had to explain his abrupt departure, Gage began to deteriorate visibly. He stopped sleeping entirely. He started talking to himself during the day. He would stand in his fields at night, staring at the barn where the woman was locked, as if expecting something to emerge from it. On the 21st night, Gage went to the barn himself. Cooper watched from a distance, concerned about his employer's increasingly unstable state of mind. Gage unlocked the barn door, entered, and remained inside for what Cooper estimated was close to 2 hours. When Gage finally emerged, he was fundamentally changed. Cooper described him as broken, like a man who had been forced to watch his own soul laid completely bare. The next morning, Gage freed every person he held enslaved, all 47 of them. He gave them manumission papers, supplies, and what money he could spare from his accounts. He told Cooper the plantation was finished and that Cooper should find other employment as quickly as possible. Then Gage personally took the woman to Charleston, but this time he did not take her to the slave traders. He took her to the port to a ship captain named William Drexel, who regularly sailed to the Caribbean islands. What Gage paid Drexel, or what agreement they reached, was never officially recorded. But the woman left Charleston on Drexel's ship, the Meridian, bound for Nassau in the Bahamas. This should have been the end of her story as far as Charleston was concerned, but it was not. 6 weeks later, Drexel returned to Charleston. He arrived at night, which was unusual for a captain of his experience. He went directly to Virgil Haskett's home and demanded to see him immediately despite the late hour. Haskett's wife later told her sister in a letter that survived in family papers that Drexel looked like a man pursued by death itself. What Drexel told Hask that night became the subject of whispered conversations throughout the trading community. The accounts vary in specific details, but the core story remains remarkably consistent across multiple sources. Drexel claimed that during the voyage to Nassau, the woman had remained in the ship's hold as cargo. She had been quiet, caused no disruptions, given the crew no reason for complaint. But at night, the sailors began experiencing nightmares, Vivid, terrible nightmares about their worst actions, their deepest shames, the things they had done that they normally succeeded in not thinking about. Drexel said his first mate, a man named Harrison, who had served with him for 8 years, woke screaming about a child he had abandoned in Liverpool 20 years earlier. Another sailor confessed to murder he had committed in Boston and escaped prosecution for. A third admitted to deserting from the British Navy, a crime punishable by death if he were ever caught. Drexel himself began dreaming about a fire. Years ago, he had owned a share in a warehouse in Philadelphia. The warehouse had burned, killing 3 night watchmen who were trapped inside. The official investigation ruled it an accidental fire, cause unknown. But Drexel knew the truth. The fire had been set deliberately by his business partner to collect insurance money on goods that were actually worthless. Drexel had known about the plan in advance and had said nothing because he profited substantially from the insurance settlement. 3 men burned to death, and he had taken money stained with their deaths and used it to purchase his ship. In his dreams, he saw those men burning. Night after night, he watched them die, and he said he would wake to find the woman standing at the entrance to the hold, just watching him. Never speaking, never moving, just watching with those unchanging eyes that seemed to see everything he had ever done and everything he had ever failed to do. When they reached Nassau, Drexel paid a local plantation owner to take the woman off his hands. He left port immediately, not waiting for his scheduled cargo pickup, not following any of his normal commercial procedures. On the voyage back to Charleston, the nightmares stopped. The crew's mood lifted. But Drexel said he could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed inside him, that the woman had somehow forced him to see himself with complete clarity for the first time in his life, and he could never return to comfortable ignorance. Drexel made one more voyage after returning to Charleston. Then he sold his ship and retired from sailing at age 43, far younger than most captains. He spent his remaining years, he died in 1868, working with freed people's aid societies and speaking publicly against the slave trade he had once profited from so handsomely. Haskett documented all of this in his private notes, trying to understand what was actually happening. He also noted that he received one final communication about the woman in early 1851, a brief letter from Nassau from the plantation owner who had purchased her from Drexel. The letter contained only a few sentences. Returning your property on next available ship to Charleston. Cannot keep her on my land. Will accept no payment for her return. Destroy all records of this transaction. The woman arrived back in Charleston in March of 1851, exactly 4 years after her first recorded sale in that city. She had traveled across the Low Country, been sold 17 times, driven men to confession and ruin, crossed the ocean, and returned. And she looked exactly the same, unchanged, unbroken, silent, has refused to sell her again. He could not. He told his brother he would rather burn his auction house to the ground than be responsible for one more sale of this particular woman. But he also could not legally free her. He did not own her, and the various bills of sale had created such a confused chain of title that it was genuinely unclear who held legal ownership. So Hask did something that went against every instinct he had developed in 20 years of trading human beings as commodities. He housed her in a small room behind his auction house office. He gave her a bed, regular meals, basic clothing. He told his clerks she was not to be disturbed or discussed with clients. He paid her a small wage from his own pocket for light cleaning work around the office. And he began what would become a 6-month investigation into her actual origins. If you are fascinated by the darkest corners of history that institutions tried to bury, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for the sealed room. We uncover the stories that make us question everything we thought we knew about the past. Tell us in the comments what you think is actually happening to these men. Is it guilt? Is it something else? Because what comes next will change everything you have assumed about this woman's story. The decision to investigate was not made from compassion, at least not initially. Has terrified of what might happen if he tried to sell her again, but more than fear, he had become consumed by a mystery that violated everything he understood about human behavior and commercial transactions. How could one woman create such consistent psychological devastation across so many different men? What was she actually doing during those nights? Or perhaps more importantly, what had been done to her that created this effect? He started with the original bill of sale from March 1847. The document identified her as property from a deceased estate in Beaufort County. But when Hasker traveled there in late April of 1851, the courthouse clear could find no record of any such estate sale. No probate filings matched the date. No administrator's report listed an enslaved woman matching her description. The records simply did not exist. The clear, an elderly man named Josiah Bentley, who had worked in the courthouse for 30 years, did remember something unusual from that period. There was a fire, Bentley said, pulling out damaged ledgers from early 1847. Took out half our records room. Some estate files were lost completely. Could be your paperwork was among what burned. But Bentley also mentioned something else. He recalled a plantation owner from near the Ashpoo River who had come through town in February of 1847 in tremendous hurry, filing multiple sale documents all at once. Edmund Lyle Bentley said he was selling off property before he died. Unusual thing was he did not appear sick, seemed healthy enough, but he acted like a man settling his final affairs. Died 2 months later anyway. Heart gave out. They said Hask requested access to what remained of Lyle's estate records. Most had been claimed by his son Gerald, but the courthouse retained copies of major transactions. Among them, the sale of 11 enslaved people in February 1847, all sold to different buyers across the Low Country. No names were recorded consistent with common practice, just ages, genders, and brief physical descriptions. But one entry caught Haskey's attention immediately. Female, approximately 27 years of age, mute, trained in household service, sold to J. Merchant, Charleston trader. J. Merchant had been Haskey in the slave trading business. He had died in 1849 during a yellow fever outbreak, and his business records had been dispersed among several other traders. Has spent 3 weeks tracking down those records, finally locating them in the possession of a retired trader named Albert Sims, who lived on Trad Street. Sims was 70 years old and suffering from consumption. He received Hask in a darkened parlor that smelled of camphor and approaching death. When Hask explained what he was looking for, Sims laughed, a wet, rattling sound that ended in coughing. "The mute woman," he said. Merchant talked about her constantly before he died. Said she was the worst mistake he ever made in business. According to Sims, Merchant had purchased the woman from Lyle's estate in February 1847 with the intention of reselling her quickly for profit. She was young, trained, supposedly docile. Exactly the type that brought premium prices from wealthy households, but Merchant could not sell her. Every potential buyer who examined her in the holding pens would make an offer, then return hours later to withdraw it. Some would not explain why. Others invented reasons, claimed she looked sickly upon closer examination, or seemed troublesome, or had some defect they had somehow missed during initial inspection. Merchant kept her for 5 weeks, longer than he had ever kept any property intended for immediate resale. During that time, Sims said Merchant became increasingly agitated. He stopped sleeping properly. He started making errors in his ledgers. He lost 2 major sales because he could not concentrate during negotiations. He told me she never did anything wrong, Sims recalled, never caused trouble, never even looked at him directly. But he said he could not stand being in the same building with her. Said she made him think about every person he had ever sold, every family he had separated, every child he had taken from her mother. He had been in the business 30 years and never thought twice about any of it. But with her there in his holding pens, he could not stop thinking about it. Said it was driving him to madness. Finally, in late March 1847, Merchant had sold her to Richard Gouillard for $1,240, the first documented sale in the pattern Haskey knew so well. Merchant died 2 years later of yellow fever. But Sims claimed that right before his death, delirious with fever, Merchant had insisted the mute woman was still in his building. He kept saying he could hear her. Sims said quietly, said she was standing in the hallway watching him, even though she had been gone for 2 years by then, even though she was nowhere near Charleston. He died calling out to her, asking her to forgive him. This conversation gave Haskey the final piece he needed to trace the woman's origins back to Edmund Lyle, but it also raised entirely new questions. If Lyle had owned her before February 1847, why had he suddenly been so desperate to sell her? What had happened on that plantation to trigger such urgent disposal of property? Has traveled to the Ashpoo River region in early June of 1851? The Lyle plantation was still operating, now under control of Edmund's son Gerald. The younger Lyle was 34 years old, a thin man with nervous mannerisms who seemed perpetually uncomfortable in his own skin. When Haskey arrived at the plantation house and explained the purpose of his visit, Gerald initially refused to discuss anything about his father's former property. "That business is closed," Gerald said sharply. "The woman was sold legally. Whatever happened after that is none of our concern or responsibility." But Haskey persisted. He spent 3 days in the area speaking with neighboring plantation owners, with shopkeepers in the nearest town, with anyone who might remember Edmund Lyle in early 1847. Gradually, a picture emerged of a man who had undergone dramatic transformation in the months before his death. A neighboring planter named Cyrus Middleton told Haskell that Edmund had come to his house in January 1847 visibly shaken and had asked to borrow Middleton's Bible. "I had known Edmund 20 years, Middleton said. Never knew him to be a religious man. Never saw him attend church except for social obligations. But that night he sat in my parlor for 3 hours reading scripture and weeping. Would not tell me what was wrong. Just kept saying he had done terrible things and needed to find a way to make peace with God before it was too late." A merchant in the town of Jacksonboro recalled Edmund Lyle coming into his store in late January 1847 and asking detailed questions about the Underground Railroad. He wanted to know if it was real, if enslaved people actually escaped successfully to the north. Strange questions for a man of his position and wealth. I told him I knew nothing about such matters, which was true enough, but I remember thinking he looked haunted, like a man who had seen something that broke him fundamentally. Armed with these accounts, Haskell returned to Gerald Lyle's plantation. This time he brought a different approach. He told Gerald that he was not trying to cause trouble for the family or expose any secrets that might damage their reputation, but that he needed to understand what had actually happened because the woman was still causing devastating problems for every man who encountered her. "She is in my custody now," Haskell said. "And if I am going to help her or protect others from whatever effect she produces, I need to know the complete truth." Something in Haskell's words, or perhaps his evident sincerity, broke through Gerald's resistance. The younger Lyle invited Haskell into his study, poured them both whiskey despite the early hour, and began to speak. "My father was not a kind man," Gerald said quietly, "but he was not unusually cruel by the standards of our world. He ran his plantation efficiently. He believed in discipline but not in excessive violence. He saw the people he enslaved as property, nothing more and nothing less. That was simply how things were, how things had always been." Edmund Lyle had owned Rachel, though Gerald said he did not know if that was her actual name or just what his father had called her since 1842. He had purchased her from a trader in Savannah, attracted by her training and her inability to speak. A mute house servant was valuable precisely because she could not gossip, could not carry tales between the slave quarters and the manor house, could not create the kind of interpersonal drama that speaking servants sometimes caused. For 3 years, Rachel had worked in the household without any incident. She was an excellent worker, meticulous, efficient, unobtrusive. But in 1845, Edmund Lyle had expanded his operation in a direction that many plantation owners pursued, but few discussed openly in polite society. He began systematically breeding enslaved people for sale. He kept records, Gerald said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Like livestock breeding records, he selected women based on physical characteristics, on health, on perceived intelligence. He chose men to father children based on similar criteria. The goal was to produce children who would bring the highest prices when sold at market age, maximum return on investment. Rachel had been among the women selected for this breeding program. She had borne her first child in late 1845. The child, a girl, was taken from her at 6 months old and sold to a plantation owner in Georgia. Rachel had reportedly shown no emotion during the sale transaction, though the enslaved woman who had assisted with the birth later told Gerald that Rachel had made that humming sound continuously for 3 days after the child was taken, that low vibration that seemed to come from deep in her chest. The second child, a boy, was born in early 1847. He was taken at 4 months old and sold to a buyer whose name Gerald claimed not to remember, though Haskell suspected the younger Lyle simply did not want to reveal it. Again, Rachel showed no outward emotion that anyone could identify, but the humming returned, lasting nearly a week this time. The third pregnancy had complications. Rachel went into labor early in late January of 1847. The child, another boy, lived for only 6 hours before dying. Edmund Lyle became convinced that Rachel had somehow killed the child deliberately, Gerald said. He thought she had willed it to die rather than let him take another baby from her. Whether this belief had any basis in medical reality was impossible to determine. Infant mortality was tragically common, especially among enslaved women who received inadequate nutrition and minimal medical care during pregnancy. But Edmund Lyle was furious. He ordered Rachel whipped 10 lashes per day for 7 consecutive days. punishment that Gerald described as excessive even by the brutal standards of their society. On the seventh day, while receiving the final set of lashes, Rachel did something that changed everything. Gerald's voice shook as he described what happened next. "I was there," he said. "I watched it occur. She had taken 69 lashes without making a single sound, not a cry, not a whimper, nothing. My father stood watching, and I think he was beginning to feel uncomfortable about what he was doing, as if he had gone too far, but did not know how to stop without appearing weak in front of the overseer and other slaves who were forced to witness the punishment. On the 70th lash, she turned her head and looked directly at him, just looked at him with complete calm, and then she opened her mouth and made that sound. Not a scream, not words, just this low tone that seemed to come from somewhere impossibly deep inside her chest. It vibrated in your bones. It made your teeth ache. It felt like it was coming from the earth itself. And while she made that sound, she held my father's gaze without blinking, without flinching, without showing anything except this terrible calm certainty. The overseer delivering the lashes stopped mid-swing. Everyone present stopped moving. It was not a long sound, maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like time stretched and warped. And when she closed her mouth and that sound ended, my father's face had gone completely white. He turned without saying another word and walked back to the house. From that day forward, Edmund Leal began to deteriorate rapidly. He could not sleep. He began seeing Rachel everywhere, in hallways she was not in rooms she had never entered. He started having what Gerald described as fits of conscience, suddenly questioning practices he had followed for decades without apparent guilt or hesitation. He tried to explain it to me once, Gerald said. He said that when Rachel made that sound while looking directly at him, something changed in his fundamental perception of reality, as if she had somehow opened a door in his mind that he had kept carefully locked his entire adult life. And all the things he had successfully avoided thinking about came flooding through that open door. He kept saying he could feel what she felt, that he understood for the first time what it actually meant to have your children torn away from you, to be powerless, to be treated as something less than human. He said the understanding was driving him mad, that he could not make it stop. Edmund Lyle lasted 3 weeks after that day. He tried everything to escape the feeling. Prayer, whiskey, throwing himself into work. Nothing helped. The understanding would not leave him. Finally, he made a desperate decision. He would sell every enslaved person on his plantation, all of them, remove all evidence of what he had done, eliminate all reminders of his crimes. He started with Rachel. She went first with falsified paperwork showing she had come from a Beaufort County estate sale, documentation deliberately designed to obscure her connection to the Lyle family. Edmund paid J. Merchant to take her, essentially bribing the trader to remove her from his sight as quickly as possible. But selling Rachel did not help. If anything, Edmund's condition worsened. He proceeded to sell 10 more people from his plantation, scattering them across the low country before his family could intervene and stop him. Then, in late March of 1847, his heart gave out. The physician said it was natural causes. Edmund was 53, overweight, under tremendous stress. But Gerald Lyle believed something different. "My father died of horror," Gerald said flatly. Horror at what he had done. Horror at being forced to truly see it, to feel it for the first time in his life. That woman, Rachel, she did not kill him with any curse or poison or supernatural power. She killed him by making him human again, by forcing him to recognize the humanity of the people he had treated as animals, by making him feel what they felt. Gerald paused, refilling his whiskey glass with hands that shook noticeably. "I wanted her gone after he died because I was terrified the same thing would happen to me. I had witnessed everything my father did. I had helped with the breeding program. I had recorded the sales. I had calculated the profit margins. If she could do to me what she did to him, make me really see, really feel what we had done, I do not think I could survive it." Has asked the question that had been burning in his mind throughout this entire conversation. What happened to her children, the 2 who survived? Gerald's face hardened. They were sold before any of this happened, both of them. I have no record of where they went. Different buyers, different states. Probably they would be what, 6 and 4 years old now? 5 and 3 when they were sold. She will never find them. Even if she searched for the rest of her life, she would never find them. The paper trail was deliberately obscured as it usually was with such sales. They are gone, lost in a system designed specifically to make people disappear. As Haskut absorbed this information, he felt something fundamental shift inside himself. For 20 years, he had facilitated exactly these kinds of separations. He had sold children away from parents. He had split families. He had separated husbands from wives. He had done it efficiently, professionally, without allowing himself to think too deeply about the human cost of these transactions. But sitting in Gerald Lye's study, hearing the cold calculation in the man's voice when he said she will never find them, Hask suddenly understood with complete clarity what Edmund Lyle had experienced. The full weight of his own actions crashed over him like a physical force. Every mother who had begged him to keep her family together, every child torn, screaming from parents' arms, every person who had looked at him with desperate hope that he might show mercy only to find none. He had dismissed all of it as sentimentality, as emotional attachment that property should not feel. But they were not property. They had never been property. They were human beings who loved and suffered and grieved exactly as he did, and he had spent 2 decades inflicting unbearable trauma on them for profit. Hask left the Lyle plantation that evening feeling as though he had aged 20 years in a single day. He returned to Charleston and went directly to his auction house. Rachel was in her small room, mending clothes by candlelight. When he entered, she looked up at him with those same calm, unchanging eyes. He told her everything he had learned about Edmund Lyle and the breeding program, about her 3 children, about the 2 who had survived and been sold away to unknown locations. He did not know if she understood the specific details. She gave no obvious sign either way, but he felt compelled to speak, to bear witness to what had been done to her, to acknowledge it as real and terrible. When he finished, she set down her mending and looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something she had never done in his presence before. She reached out and touched his hand just briefly, just for a moment. Her hand was rough from decades of forced labor, scarred from old injuries, but the touch was gentle, almost forgiving. Hask broke down and wept. In the weeks that followed, Hask made a series of decisions that would have shocked anyone who had known him during his trading years. He could not legally free Rachel. The tangled chain of title made that impossible without risking court intervention that might result in her being seized and resold to someone far worse. But he could make her effectively unsellable, and he could try to help her find what she was searching for. He hired a clerk, a young man named Samuel Parrish, who had recently arrived in Charleston from Philadelphia and had abolitionist sympathies, to search through sales records from 1845 and 1847. Parrish spent 3 months meticulously combing through ledgers, bills of sale, estate records, and auction house documentation, trying to trace the sales of 2 children who matched the ages and descriptions Gerald Lyle had provided. It was nearly impossible work. Children that young were rarely recorded with much detail. Ages were approximate. Physical descriptions were minimal. Names changed or were omitted entirely. But Parrish was determined, and Haskell paid him well for his efforts. They found 17 possible matches, 11 boys who might have been Rachel's second child, 6 girls who could have been the first. The children had been sold across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Some had been resold multiple times since their original purchase. 3 had died. Parrish found death records in estate inventories. The others' fates were unknown. Lost in a system designed to make people disappear without trace. Hask presented this information to Rachel in September of 1851. He had compiled it into a document that listed names when they existed, locations, current owners, when that information could be determined. He watched as she read through it slowly, her finger tracing each line with careful attention. When she finished, she looked up at him, and for the first time since he had known her, he saw something in her expression that might have been hope. She wrote a question on a slate he had provided for communication. "Can you help?" Has knew exactly what she was asking. Could he help her find them? Could he help her? A woman with forged freedom papers and no legal right to travel unaccompanied through slave states, reach her children, and perhaps arrange their freedom. The honest answer was no. It was functionally impossible. Even attempting it would be extremely dangerous for her and potentially illegal for him. The children's current owners had legal title to them. Rachel had no parental rights under law. She had never had them. And a black woman traveling alone through the Deep South asking questions about enslaved children would attract exactly the kind of attention that could get her killed or re-enslaved. But Haskell looked at this woman who had survived horrors he could not fully imagine, who had been brutalized and broken and somehow transformed into something that made brutal men confront their own cruelty, and he could not refuse her. "I will try," he said. I cannot promise anything, but I will try. This decision, more than any other, marked Haskell's complete transformation from slave trader to something entirely different. Over the next 4 months, he used his extensive network of contacts across the South to gather more information about the 17 children Parrish had identified, traders he had worked with, plantation owners he had sold to, clerks and auctioneers, and estate managers. He presented himself as conducting routine business, researching potential property for investment, never revealing his true purpose. By January of 1852, he had narrowed the list to 5 strong possibilities: 2 boys and 3 girls who matched the ages, physical descriptions, and sale dates they were searching for. But confirming which, if any, were actually Rachel's children would require something Haskell could not provide: direct contact, personal recognition, some form of confirmation that only Rachel herself could give. The solution came from an unexpected source. Samuel Parrish had connections to Charleston's small but active network of people who helped enslaved individuals escape to freedom. Parrish suggested that this network might be able to help Rachel travel north while also making contact with people who could investigate the children's whereabouts more safely than a black woman traveling alone through slave states. It was extraordinarily risky. If Rachel were caught, she would be re-enslaved immediately. If Haskett's involvement were discovered, he would face serious criminal charges and complete social ruin. But both of them had reached a point where those risks seemed acceptable compared to doing nothing. In February of 1852, 11 months after Rachel had first come into his custody, Hask helped arrange her departure from Charleston. She left on a moonless night, guided by conductors who would take her north through a series of safe houses and hidden routes that had been developed over years of dangerous work. Hask gave her money, more money than he could really afford given his deteriorating financial situation and the document Parrish had compiled, now updated with the most recent information about the 5 children who might be hers. Before she left, Rachel did something that surprised everyone present. She wrote a brief message on her slate and showed it to Haskell. It said simply, "Thank you for remembering you are human." Then she vanished into the darkness, beginning a journey whose outcome Haskell would never fully know. Has never received direct communication from Rachel after her departure. The nature of the Underground Railroad required absolute secrecy. Correspondence was dangerous, could be intercepted, could compromise everyone involved in the network. But over the following months and years, he occasionally received indirect news through Parrish's connections. Rachel had reached Philadelphia safely by March of 1852. From there, she traveled to New York and then to various cities across the North. The fragmentary information Parrish received suggested she was working with abolitionist organizations, helping other escaped slaves adjust to freedom, and continuing her search for her children through whatever channels were available to her. One report received in late 1853 indicated that she might have located her daughter, a girl of approximately 8 years old, enslaved on a plantation in central Georgia, who matched the physical description perfectly and whose age aligned with what they knew. The report said Rachel had made contact through intermediaries, free black people who could travel more safely in the South, and was working to arrange the child's freedom, either through purchase or escape. Whether this effort succeeded, Hask never learned. Communication stopped after that report, and Parrish eventually lost contact with the specific network members who had been tracking Rachel's movements. What Has did know was what happened in Charleston after Rachel left. Several of the traders present at a meeting where he had shared Rachel's full story began experiencing their own crises of conscience. Within 2 years of her departure, 3 major auction houses in Charleston closed permanently. The owners gave various public explanations: age, health, changing market conditions, but privately some admitted they could no longer continue in the trade. One of them, a man named Francis Kershaw, who had operated one of Charleston's largest slave marts, told Haskett in 1854, "I keep thinking about what you told us about that woman and what was done to her, and I realize I have done the same things hundreds of times, separated mothers from children, bred people like livestock, sold families apart for profit. I used to tell myself it was just business. But business built on that kind of suffering is not business. It is evil, and I cannot do it anymore." Has himself closed his auction house in August of 1856. He was struggling financially. His heart was no longer in the work, and without ruthless focus on profit, his business could not compete. But more than that, he simply could not bear to continue. He sold the building and used the proceeds to establish a small fund that provided assistance to freed people in Charleston, helping them find employment, housing, and legal support as they built new lives in freedom. It was not enough. It could never be enough to balance the harm he had caused over 20 years of trading human beings. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement that the people he had bought and sold were human beings deserving of dignity and respect, not commodities to be exploited for profit. The Civil War came to Charleston in 1861, and the social order that had made Rachel's suffering possible began its violent collapse. The city was bombarded, burned, occupied by Union forces. The slave trade that had enriched so many Charleston families ended with emancipation. The plantation system crumbled. Virgil Haskey lived until 1868. In his final years, he wrote extensively in private journals about his transformation from slave trader to abolitionist. He documented his investigation into Rachel's origins, his growing understanding of the horror he had participated in, and his attempts to make some form of amends. The journals include this entry from December of 1867. I received word today through an old contact that a woman matching Rachel's description was seen in Philadelphia in 1865 working with freed people arriving from the South. The contact said she appeared healthy and was accompanied by a young woman of approximately 20 years who called her mother. I cannot confirm this is the same woman, but I choose to believe it is. I choose to believe she found at least one of her children, that after everything that was done to her, she achieved something that so many others never could. It gives me small comfort in my final months to think that perhaps despite all the cruelty of this world, some measure of justice occasionally prevails. Whether this sighting was actually Rachel, whether she truly found her daughter, these questions remain unanswered. Rachel disappeared from documented history after leaving Charleston in 1852. No definitive records trace her movements after that point, but fragments suggest a life lived in service to others who had suffered similar trauma. Abolitionists working in the decade before the Civil War occasionally mentioned a mute woman who helped coordinate escapes and assisted newly freed people. Frederick Douglass's papers include a brief reference to a woman who could not speak, but whose presence at abolitionist meetings seemed to steel the resolve of everyone present. A Philadelphia Quaker's diary from 1858 describes a silent woman of remarkable bearing who worked tirelessly with escaped slaves, seeming to understand their trauma in ways others could not. These references might all describe Rachel, or they might describe other women, other survivors of slavery's brutality who found their own ways to resist and rebuild. The system of slavery created thousands of tragedies like Rachel's. Women who were brutalized, who lost children to sale, who endured unspeakable suffering. Most of their stories were never recorded. Most of their names are lost to history. Rachel's story survives only because her effect on the men who tried to own her was dramatic enough to generate documentation, journals, letters, business records, whispered conversations that were later written down. But for every Rachel whose story was partially preserved, how many others suffered in silence, their stories erased completely from the historical record? The mystery of the woman no master could keep is not really about supernatural power or curses. It is about something far more disturbing. It is about what happens when systematic cruelty meets human conscience, about the psychological toll of participating in systems built on suffering, about what emerges when someone who has been stripped of everything finds a way to strip away the comfortable lies that allow brutality to continue. Rachel survived by becoming a mirror. She reflected back at men what they had done. She forced them to feel what they had inflicted. She made them see themselves clearly, perhaps for the first time, and most of them could not survive that clarity. They collapsed under the weight of their own actions once denial was no longer possible. Her silence was not weakness. It was the most powerful form of testimony, a witness who could not be silenced by threats or persuaded by bribes, who simply existed as living evidence of what the system had done. Her presence in a house was accusation incarnate. Her calm gaze was judgment that required no words. The broader lesson extends far beyond one woman's story. Every social system built on systematic oppression creates its own Rachels. People who survive not through submission but through transformation, who find power in unexpected places, who refuse to let their oppressors escape the weight of conscience. Charleston tried to erase Rachel from history. They burned records, they destroyed documentation, they refused to speak her name, but fragments remain, stories persist. Truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at suppression. Rachel's story deserves to be remembered not as a ghost story or supernatural tale, but as history, as testimony to what humans endure, what they survive, and what they become when pushed beyond what should be survivable. As evidence that systems of oppression never fully control the people they attempt to crush. and as a reminder that conscience, once truly awakened, can be more powerful than any weapon. What do you think happened to Rachel? Do you believe she found her children? Do you think one person could have such a profound psychological impact on so many people? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss our investigations into the stories history tried to bury. And remember, the histories we choose to forget often contain the lessons we most desperately need to, 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 most desperately need to.